I would say, around the world who are all doing events marking the Shloshim of Rabbi Sacks, and organizations which have budgets that can pay, a lot of money to a lot of speakers. I would want the people sitting on my right in that any session around the world. In fact, actually, they have been talking at many sessions. They're probably, the official Rabbi Sacks events, if you like. Are you involved in that one?
A small part.
Yeah, the small part.
A cameo.
So probably, okay. And Rabbi Alex is also speaking. He's actually running the Siyum Mishnayos on behalf of the family. He's also speaking. Maybe he's making notes now.
Waiting for them to ask something.
Yeah. Speaking. So we are. When we talk about Rabbi Sacks' Talmidim, we have people here who really espouse that, and I think it's a privilege that for you and just as a word to say about Eretz HaTzvi as a yeshiva, which is that we always pride ourselves as a yeshiva about being at the cutting edge of contemporary Jewish thought in terms of what we decide to teach, the people we decide to teach in the yeshiva, and I think this symbolizes that desire of like always trying to think about those things, and so it's not a coincidence that we're all here in this room today, and I'm going to start by asking both of you about Rabbi Sacks' legacy. I'm going to ask a two-part question. The first is, what do you think will be his greatest legacy? And the second part of that question is, Rabbi Sacks you can find him in many different settings. You can find him, he's got many books, you've got YouTube playlists, you've got parasha sheets, right? And you go to your Siddur Matzah shelf, you have Siddur Matzah. Which of those things will be the most enduring and have the most impact on the next generation?
The truth is, what do they say? Nevuah is given to the shotim. Nevuah is given to idiots. Who knows what his legacy will be? But I'll say a couple of things. I'd say that the two things, if you're asking me what will he be remembered for and what will be his lasting legacy. The first thing is, it actually is really amazing. I have been quite astounded at the outpouring of grief and the way it impacted such a wide group of people. I don't remember too many, even Gedolei Yisrael passing and having this depth of effect on so many people. And the question is what? Why? And I really do think he represented something which is almost like irreplaceable. Sometimes if a posik dies, so you ask your shayla to him, he was the best guy, but somebody else will come up somebody else can paskin halacha, right? A teacher, so somebody else can. But Rabbi Sacks was really quite a unique hybrid. He never liked the title modern Orthodox, and we can debate why he didn't particularly like it, but I don't know anyone else who was able to fuse such a powerful emunah, Jewish teachings, Jewish texts, and a knowledge of pretty much anything. He read it all. He was able to bring Judaism to world problems, and he was able to bring world literature to Torah. You read his Perushim on the Torah, and he'll mention all sorts of things. Just reading something about Shimon HaLevi last week, he starts talking about Shmukla's dilemma. Whoever Shmukla is, well, he must be Jewish, but anyway. And he's, whatever it might be, he's always bringing world philosophy into Torah and bringing Torah to the world. And I just think in that regard, there's no one in the pipeline, just mamash no one, who seems to have that breadth and that confidence and that the grace with which he did it and the elegance with which he did it is just remarkable. And in that degree, I think he was a towering figure and he stood for something. Rabbi Sacks wrote in one of his articles, he said that sometimes the contribution of the philosopher is not necessarily what he says, it's what he represents. He talks about how Rabbi Soloveitchik, he says, I don't know which of Rabbi Soloveitchik's works is going to make a difference, but Rabbi Soloveitchik being able to talk in a modern language and be able to reflect existentially on his own dilemmas. That allowed people to think that way. That allowed, so Rabbi Sacks has really, it might not be what he said here, there, or what have you, but he really represents something which now we all feel that we could do, right? Open up our bookshelves, open up our minds, open up our ability to be able to be confident with Torah and affirmation. What will be as lasting, the book which will last the longest, difficult for me to say, but I have a feeling that for Jews it'll be whatever goes along with the Jewish bookshelf. So I would, if I had to hazard a guess, I think it would be related to his Perushim on the Torah, because I think that people are always learning Parashat Shavua, and either his Perushim to the Torah or his Perushim to the Machzorim, where each of his introductions to the Machzorim is like a masterpiece introduction to that particular Chag, and really frames it. I have a feeling that's going to last longer than his books about wider morality, which each one was written in response to a particular world event. That's just my sense of that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that one. I think you're right. I think that
I'd just like to say that Dr. Daniel Rose over here has been writing for years an adjunct to Rabbi Sacks' weekly articles, the family edition. So he's actually been digesting and processing Rabbi Sacks' works to help families and children to be able to discuss it. So he's really been part of the team, the Rabbi Sacks team. So he's been in the inner circle when it comes to these things.
which is, as I've described a couple of times today, it was like a dream job for me as an educator to have that role, to be charged with that role, to take his ideas and pass it on to the next generation, which was you. Now, as far as I'm concerned, your responsibility is to engage in his thoughts in the original. You don't need the packaging anymore. You've got to go read the books, listen to the speeches. But I think that the fact that he wanted and was so engaged in the next generation and wanted to spread his ideas, I think is a powerful statement in itself. For me, his legacy, I fell in love with him when I was exactly your age. And I fell in love with him as a thinker, because for me, his thoughts, I like to call it big picture Judaism. So Rav Soloveitchik was also a very important influence in my life, and many other Jewish philosophers. But I think that on some level, I feel like I'm totally out of my depth here, but I'm going to suggest that Rabbi Soloveitchik tried to describe the condition of what it is to be a Jew standing in front of Hashem and having a relationship with Hashem. Ish halakha, learning man of faith, what that was as an individual. Rav Sacks had a different vision. His message was, what is this enterprise called the Jewish people? What is Torah Judaism? What is it going to achieve in the world? How are we going to create a world in the image of Torah values? And for me, that was, I had I'm just putting myself, it feels like yesterday, I was sitting in your seat, immersed in 2 years in a yeshiva very similar to yours, with many of the same teachers. And I loved it, and I was immersed in this Judaism that was a little bit inward-looking thing. I mean, it wasn't. All the Rebbeim were very much part of the world, and they, were engaged in the world. But the Judaism that to be engrossed in learning Gemara and in understanding Halakha, it's very much a Judaism that is telling me what I need to do in order to be a Jew, in order to have a relationship with Hashem. Suddenly Rabbi Sacks comes along and says, but you know what, there's a bigger picture here. Halakha is actually a vehicle to achieve this bigger national goal and really universal goal in terms of the world. That for me was mind-blowing, and it was a Judaism that inspired me and I became passionate about, and it was a Judaism I was proud of. And then to hear him represent that Judaism to world leaders and for them to be inspired by the messages had such an impact on me. So for me, his legacy is that he was a thinker that presented Judaism in the largest context possible, and in terms of what's going to survive. So I fear, I only really thought about it now when Rav Alex said that, but yeah, so many of his books were kind of nevuah for our generation. So read them quickly, but the next generation they'll feel a little bit too historical. But perhaps his perushim on the text that we've managed to make eternal. Every generation, maybe they will be long lasting. But thank God, I'll shout out, although I don't know if we're online or not, but shout out to his team, to Dan Sacco and the rest of his team, who've managed to take it made him into this kind of global brand through social media and technology and other vehicles. It's all there out there for us to engage in. So you never got a chance to, I imagine most of you never got a chance to hear him live, and that's heartbreaking. But there's enough video out there that you could try and tap into that and hear in his own words his magnificence as an oratory.
I just want to add something in that regard. Right, Sacks was like really into tech. He was actually completely non-tech savvy himself.
Well, I was going to say, because you said, I actually messaged Dan, so something I was watching that you said, because Rob Alex has been out there, and you said he's like the king of tech. He couldn't turn on the computer himself, but he understood the power of it and why it was important.
He wrote about the fact, for example, that the Torah was given at the moment the alphabet was created. In other words, when hieroglyphics can only be read by a very small number of people because you have to learn so many symbols. But to read the alphabet, it's just 22 symbols. It can be democratic. And he said, at the time when the alphabet was making a revolution in literacy, suddenly how's the Torah given? In writing. It's unbelievable. Everybody can read the Torah. It's just amazing. And he said there were other like sort of quantum leaps in terms of, and he said one of those quantum leaps is going to be the internet. And he really realized very early on that if you can use tech and the internet was like at the heart of his enterprise, because he understood both as chief rabbi and then when he finished being chief rabbi that his website had to be totally out there. And in fact, he did some remarkable things once when video technology started getting better. He asked everybody to send him videos with a question, and he would answer people with a 2-3 minute answer. And he had people sending from all the way around the world, and they'd release these 40-minute videos with question, answer, question, answer. I'm sure you can find them somewhere on YouTube. And it was just amazing because people really felt they'd been listened to. They had an opportunity to it was exciting. It was really exciting. And he was doing something that people, half his age weren't doing. And I think he really understood that using the internet really could connect people in a fabulous way. So the fact that there really is so much online is really quick.
I would just
sorry. At the beginning, he called it the YouTube. Right at the beginning, when it just came.
But Simon before, and I'm pleased she said this because this was my sense, but I felt bad saying it. But she affirmed it. She knows it much better than me. There were things that weren't natural to him. So he wasn't always a people's person. He pushed himself to grow to become a people's person. He also surrounded himself with people like Simma, like Joanna, who took over from Simma, like marrying his wife Elaine, who would push him to be that and to help him to be that. And when it comes to technology, it was the same. He might not have known what the next big thing was, but he surrounded himself with people that would know. But in principle, what is the next big thing? Because we need to harness it was his kind of motto. And I have to tell you, there are many heartbreaking things about the fact that he died so young, because 72 in our generation is very, very young. One of the things is that there's a list of books that I assumed he had in his head. His team told me they're on a piece of paper somewhere that he was going to write and that will never be written. That is for me, breaks my heart. Another thing was a project that he actually started, which is I think an offspring from that. That there's a company that it's like augmented reality, where you basically will have a kind of a Rabbi Sacks there, and you'll be able to access him and ask him any question you want. And they've been collecting questions for the last year or two that he was then going to address as many of these questions as you can. So, future generations will be able to ask him a question and he would respond in some way. But that project won't that day now.
I'm going to open the questions in a second, but using that as a segue to things that he never got around to write. One thing that will come out at some point is his Chumash. He was writing on the Chumash, and that possibly, based on what you're saying, that could be even greater legacy.
Still waiting to see how far he got. That's the question. How far did he get with it? I don't know.
Right.
He finished the translation, which in itself is a big accomplishment, and any translation is a parish in itself, and that's actually gone to print now. But we're not sure. They'll finish in some form his Chumash with the parish on all Chumash Torah. But how much of it is in the parish form that he wanted it to be, and how much of it is a collection of his other writings.
Okay, at this point, let's take some questions from. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So, So only South African accents for this round. Okay. So 1, 2.
Non-Afrikaans in English.
Samir talked about how pluralistic and inclusive Rav Sacks was, and I was wondering how Rav Sacks related to Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, and what he thought about them.
I've been writing a weekly debate since I've got here, and when I like come up with an idea on the parasha, I often get nervous coming up and actually giving over the idea to quite a number of people. And what would you suggest from with Rav Sacks' background, how he came up with these Hiddushim and how I can be confident in mine?
We were talking in the previous class about how just because you're Jewish, it's not enough. You have to actually act on that. And I was wondering if Rav Sacks believed more in the ideology of the Kuzari and the fact that we are inherently special, and therefore we are Jewish, or more like the Rambam, who thinks that because we have the Torah, it's what makes us special. I was wondering.
Okay, so three excellent questions. Which one's going to?
I'd like to take the one about Reform and Conservative. Rabbi Sacks, first of all, how does he relate to Reform and Conservative? Rabbi Sacks was an Orthodox thinker, and he was unbending in so many ways in that regard. He wasn't interested in changing halacha for all sorts of new fads. He also always felt that you could always go find other places where people would change halacha. He wasn't in that direction. And yet Rabbi Sacks' first books that he wrote, Traditional Alternatives and One People, were actually about Jewish unity, and it was the thing which bothered him the most at the beginning. Why is it that we seem to be fragmenting as a nation? And what he actually develops in both of those books is something he calls inclusivist Judaism. And what he essentially was interested in doing was not necessarily compromising halacha, but opening the doors of discussion wide. And he really felt that there was no reason to reject any conversation, and that we could talk. And if we opened the conversation, we would find some sort of common ground. He wasn't interested in conceding ground, but he basically said, he talks about the notion of machloket Hashem Shamayim, and he says if we can all still be within the discussion, if we can be having a discussion together, then we will keep people in. I think he had a deep emunah that actually, if we had people in the discussion, eventually they'd come to what he saw as the truth of Torah, but he doesn't say that explicitly. I'll also mention something which is, if you search on this week's Parshat Shavua, on Parshat Vayeshev, he has an amazing, lovely little story. And he tells on the story of Yudah and Tamar. With Tamar, there's a Rashi which talks about how better to throw yourself into a furnace than ever to embarrass somebody. And he tells a story about when he was a rabbinical student at Jews College. It was the Orthodox Rabbinical College in London. They were once sent to a sort of cross-communal, interdenominational conference in Switzerland, where they had rabbinical students from all different denominations, and they went with their Rebbe, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who also just passed away. And he said they were, doing their minyan, and Orthodox minyan, and suddenly they're putting on their tefillin b'shachris, and in walks one of the Reform rabbinical students with her talis and tefillin, and sits together with the men. And he said, we quickly went to scurry, over to the Rosh Yeshiva and said, what do we do? And he said, don't do anything. The worst thing you can do is embarrass him. And he quoted that Rashi. Just once, it's a once only minyan, it's not a regular shul, don't worry about it. The worst thing you can do is embarrass him. And he had a strong sense of menschlichkeit which went along with it. Never ever, to the worst thing you can do, embarrass another person. Therefore, he really believed in his method was really not to build the walls high, was to bring people into the conversation. To say, okay, what can you add? Accept the terms that we're going to discuss a point of halakha, or a point of Jewish thought. We've got this whole thing. Let's not just be in our boxes, right? Let's have a conversation together. And he felt that that would actually be something that could bridge the boundaries and would be able to bring people inside. By the way, nothing I said here is in any way to be taken as sort of halachic points for, if you're in university, everything has to be dealt with, with sensitivity to local sensitivities, and has to be dealt with consultation with qualified people. But if you're asking about how he dealt with it, or what I've read, that was his approach, to really be as inclusive as he could be.
So I'll just add a little bit to that. That's for sure in terms of his thought, and One People is a book I would recommend to go. It's one of his earliest books, but in the reality of his chief rabbinate, so there were a number of controversies that he had to deal with. I don't really want to go into them, and I don't know. None of us really know the. I mean, there are some people. Simmer knows the real stories. I don't know the real ins and outs of the stories. I can tell you what I remember being someone who lived through them in terms of a member of Anglo Jewry. One of them was the Limud Conference, which is this massive conference that Anglo Jewry, UK Jewry, should be very proud of. Now it's up to 2,000 or 3,000 people, which for a small community is a very large number, who come together every winter break to learn Torah, and in its broadest sense, a lot of cultural sessions and things like that. And it's cross-denominational, it's a pluralistic, ideologically so. He was actually one of the original people to help to set it up when it was really at the beginning an educators conference. And then it grew way beyond an educators conference, and it became this kind of flagship, and now the Limud is growing all around the world. And when he became chief rabbi, it became a hot button topic, and the Bet Din didn't want him to go there, because to go there as an Orthodox rabbi, especially to go there as a chief rabbi, would give legitimacy to non-Orthodox Judaism. And I think it was very painful for him to not go there, but he didn't want to Rabbi Mervis, one of the first things he did as chief rabbi was go to Limud. He's a different person, living in a different world, and he navigated that controversy differently. And I don't actually remember it being very controversial at the time, maybe because Rabbi Sacks had navigated the controversy well. Rabbi Sacks decided not to go out to battle for that. I was always sure that it was painful, and I've since heard stories that he would invite the organisers to his house to give them chizuk. If there's no better statement of support for the Limud conference than that, but he wouldn't go there. I heard for the first time Rav Benny Lau, who was the Rav Shaliach when I was a Bulgarian in Bnei Akiva in London. So Rav Benny spoke in the, I think it was the Matam tribute. Anyway, he spoke usually, and he said that when he got to London and he arrived at the Bayit, on his desk was an invitation to Limud. And he knew that it was controversial, and he said, I need to go and speak to Rabbi Sacks, the chief rabbi, to find out what I should do. And he went to Rabbi Sacks, and he actually said, I'm not asking you for Psak Halakha, I just want to know what you think, because I think my Benny wanted to allow him the ability to not listen to what Rabbi Sacks said. And Rabbi Sacks turned to him, looked him in the eye, and said, it is a mitzvah for you to go to Limud. So for me, that says everything. When you're chief rabbi, it's a political position, and you're navigating such, communal politics. It's nonsense. But these stories are what tell us what he really felt. So while I agree with everything what Alex said, that there was absolutely no nonsense commitment to halachic Judaism, Orthodox halachic Judaism, in terms of the inclusivism, in terms of reaching out to all Jews, and his message. Also, one last anecdote before we move on to one of the other questions. I've been at several conferences, some that he was at and some that he wasn't. It became a running joke that anyone that stood up to say anything of any kind of Torah content would quote him. People from across the spectrum. And it became like they prepared their speeches and found that they were the 7th or 8th person in a row to quote Rabbi Sacks. Because his message was so, especially in the later years, was so universally applicable, there was something for everyone. He made sure that he didn't dwell on what separates us, but rather what can unite us. And that, I think, is the power of his vision and the way he delivered it, is that there were Jews and even non-Jews all around the world from across society that found something inspiring in things that he said. Should we move on to the other question?
Okay, so do you on his question about Jews or Jews? Yeah.
Well, for that, it's an easy one for me. Although it actually leads to another controversy that he had to deal with in his chief rabbinate when he published the book Dignity of Difference. I'd never spoken to him or even heard him talk about the Kuzari, but I am familiar with the Kuzari you're referring to, and Rambam's approach to that. For me, the Kuzari is a million miles away from his position as a Jewish philosopher. I don't think he felt that there was anything in fact, the Hefer, he continuously focused on every human being being created with Tzelem Elokim, therefore being equal in spiritual value and connection to God. And the only thing that separates the Jewish people from other peoples and other religions is that we have the Torah, which is a very Rambam approach to it. But more than that, he said that we have the Torah, and the Torah is not just because God loves us more, so he gave us this gift of the Torah, rather it's a responsibility, it's a radical responsibility for our national mission, which, the books to read are Radical Letter in the Scroll, Radical Then, Radical Now.
Letter in the Scroll has a chapter called The Chosen People, so check it out.
That's the one.
So we've got it here in our library, and you can. It's right at the back, and there's actually a chapter called The Chosen People, so you can check that out. And in regard to your question about finding the confidence, right? I would just like to say that Rabbi Sacks was the most unbelievably encouraging person to try and give you confidence for what you wanted to do in any sphere of your of what you could give. He would always say, find what you're passionate about, right? Find what you really care about, do it as well as you can, and do that for the Jewish people. But I can definitely tell you that my story, the way I met Rabbi Sacks was very simple. Well, first, when I was a student, I was like a crazy groupie. Every time I saw a lecture by Rabbi Sacks, right? Me and we used to like, every night I used to have a chavruta, but if there was a Rabbi Sacks lecture, there was no chavruta. Me and my chavruta, we'd always fill up the car, and we'd drive to wherever he was giving a lecture, and we'd listen to him. I've got all my handwritten notes from those times, because it was before I had a laptop. And so I was a bit of a groupie, and Rabbi Sacks, when he was starting to make the move to be chief rabbi, started creating some conferences about modern Orthodox conferences. The first one was about the Jewish people. The second one was about the place of women in Orthodoxy. The first one I couldn't actually go to. I was very upset because it was the day before an big exam I had to take for university. I couldn't go. It was actually when I got my first book autographed by Rabbi Sacks, because a good friend of mine, she bought me the book, and it said, with best wishes from Jonathan Sacks. And I was so enamored with Jonathan Sacks, I couldn't believe she'd actually got something with my name, written by Jonathan Sacks to me. And the next week it was her birthday, and I sent her a birthday card and signed it Jonathan Sacks, because I was sure she had faked his signature, because I just couldn't believe he'd actually signed a book for me. But he actually was very generous about signing books. In the next conference I went as a 22-year-old student, and I could not believe that everybody there seemed ancient. Now, when I say they seemed ancient, they were probably in their 30s, but for me that was exceedingly, exceedingly old. And I thought, these people are all like stuck in their ways, they're never going to change. We need a conference for students, and we need a conference for high schoolers. And I, in some ridiculous moment, wrote down a whole document about how I thought we should do a conference for them and handed it to somebody on Rabbi Sacks' committee. And didn't think about it ever again. Until 6 months later, I got a phone call from his office saying, could you please come to a meeting, we're discussing your proposal. And I said, what proposal? And he said, well, you wrote a proposal, handed it into the committee, and we want to discuss it. And suddenly I remembered this document I'd written, and it was the most bizarre experience I ever had. I walked into this room, and a lot of old people there, and they look at me, and I give my pitch. They've all got photocopies of my piece of paper. And I'm like, and then one goes, 25, then one goes 35, and somebody else says, okay, so 30, agreed? Yes, agreed. Thank you, Pat. I walk out the room and I said to the secretary, what just happened? What was that? They said, they just approved your conference for £30,000 budget.
Do you know those days was well known?
And suddenly I found myself like on this committee for this conference, which we set up for sixth formers, for 11th and 12th graders and students. where they brought fluent speakers from all over the world because they had all this money, and they rented London School of Economics for the day. And it was like a really, and that was how I met Rabbi Sacks, right? Because suddenly suddenly I was on his committee, and every time he had a problem figuring things out, they're like, okay, in the car, let's go around to Rabbi Sacks' house. And that was how I built, that was my first kasha with him. But he had that ability to take young people. I was just a B'nai Akiva Madrich, 22 years old, and say, you've got a good idea, I believe in you. So, believe in yourself. That's what he would have said. You've got an idea, get out there, find the confidence. Maybe you want to speak it. If it's difficult for you to speak, write it. If it's difficult for you to write, send it to your cousins, right? Whatever it might be, if you've got an idea, get it out there. And he gave such energy to 2 generations. We're evidence of it. I can tell you every leader I know who's come out of Anglo Jewry, whether they are Rabbanim, whether they're educators, whether they're just involved in Israel leadership, whatever it might be, everyone all says, I had that conversation with Rabbi Sacks. He gave me such ability, such encouragement, I started beginning to believe in myself, right? And I even was joking with his son that his son had a Zoom shiva, and I mentioned this to his son, Josh, and he said he actually used to have a joke going with his dad. That his dad had a load of management consultancy. Apparently, there's a management consultancy book about how you can, I don't know, in one meeting, his father used to say that all I need to do is somebody comes with an idea and I just say, do it. That's all I need to do. But I think it was like a joke between them. He used to say a lot more wise things than that.
I'll just add that there was he had some videos for the Harvard Business School of Leadership, and one of the questions they asked him was kind of, how do you become a leader, and how do you kind of move from like theory to reality. One of the things he says is that he listened to all the people who gave him feedback, negative or positive, about the things that he did in his life, and he really kind of used that, and then that motivated him to be a leader. And he then, when he achieved those things, tried to do that to other people. It was a conscious effort that he made. So, for example, like someone said to him once, they said, "You're not a people's person. How can you be a rabbi?" So he learned from that he needs to learn how to be a people's person. But someone else said to him, "Sacks, you believe you're an ideals person. That's what you do." And he realized that he could convey ideas in a very strong way. And I want to ask you, how many times have you said to a friend or you're really good at this, maybe you should do this? We don't do that enough, I think. And that's it. He kind of used his stature to do that to people, but that's something maybe we can all take. Okay.
I just want to say the podcast with Rabbi Efron Goldberg that Simmer quoted and I quoted in my class session. So in there, Rabbi Goldberg asked him about failure, and he talks about how many times he failed at so many things. And one of the things he says is that you have to just get up there and say, well, what can I learn from this? You have to believe in yourself and believe in the big picture. Like, I believe I can do this, the big picture. Maybe it's not going to be that way, it'll be a different way. But self-belief is very important.
Okay, I'll take one last question if anyone has.
Okay. Well, first of all, this is an amazing day, even though I'm not from the UK. Michael's a little worried that we wouldn't enjoy it. I did enjoy
Michael
it.
only did this day so that he could get 3 people with a British accent on the That's why Michael did it. That's it. I mean, Rabbi Sacks was normal enough, but that was the real reason.
I started reading Radical Then Radical Now / The Letter in the Scroll, and I was just wondering, I love the book so much, but there's no way that I can read 30 books in 1 year. So which books would you say are not only important to read, but are important to own for the future?
You're allowed to read them after this year, at the beginning.
Get
First of all, Shana Bear. And second of all, I always say you should start with that one. And I think that the step up from there is future tense. And I describe those 2 books as his philosophy of Judaism. They are really written, even though they can easily be accessed by a broader audience, they're written to Jews who want to understand Judaism, the vision he had for Judaism. And especially future tense, he brings in ideas that he doesn't bring in so much in Radical Then Radical Now, like the role of Israel in his vision for Judaism, which I think is very important as well. Also, there's a chapter in there that is the kind of the birth of the idea for the Great Partnership, which is his book on Torah and Science. So there's a good chapter in there about that in future tense. So that would be the second book. After that, then you need to decide what interests you. There are, I don't know, I divided books into, there were books that he wrote for a broader audience about society. If you're into political science and kind of behavioral economics and that kind of stuff, so there's a bunch of books I can recommend there. If you want the Frum books, the books he published with Corin are his Frum books. So that's the Machzorim and the Parsha books, they're brilliant as well, the Haggadah. What would you say?
So I will say there's one book which I feel, I don't know which book is essential to read. I do think you can, read one or two and see how it goes, but I do find one of the books very, very, he's got a book called To Heal a Fractured World, The Ethics of Responsibility. And it's almost, to me, when I read it, it's all about chesed. Basically, the whole book is about chesed, and it's almost like a chesed musa book. It's just unbelievable.
With some great stories.
It's just, tons of stories.
Really good
He
stories.
actually writes an introduction that he deliberately wants to bring as many stories that people respond to stories. By the way, one of the things that hasn't come up is he loved two things that people don't necessarily expect that. He loved humor, and he writes in one of the very, very, probably one of the lightest books, Celebrating Life, he writes about how much he loves humor and how important humor is in cheering people up. And the other thing he loved was music, right? And he loved every type of music. He grew up on the Beatles, right? And he often related to the Beatles in some of his drashot and his writing. But people talk about how there was a period recently where he got really into Eminem and was like, anything which he felt had any sense of power and meaning. He was a big fan of Leonard Cohen. He loved classical music, particularly Beethoven and Schubert. In fact, he once gave a shiur about Kol Nidre and showed how the music of Kol Nidre is exactly the same as one of Beethoven's opuses. And he's actually not wrong about it. I looked up the opus to listen to it. And it's just amazing how these were all parts of his personality. It wasn't just writing, it wasn't just speaking. In a video that I showed the guys, just some of it, he name drops about 5 different movies, right? So it was just really amazing how he had a voracious appetite to know where people were and to apply religious messaging and messaging of meaning to people wherever they were. So it just really is quite something.
Okay, before we finish off, I'd like to actually just ask you guys, just a couple of people to very briefly reflect on something that they have taken from the day. Anyone want to share short? Because what I'm going to ask Daniel and Ravan, it's just a kind of couple of tips of where next? What can we do to continue the legacy? How is this relevant to our lives? Does anyone have any thoughts that they would like to share about what they've got from today? What they didn't have before?
Something that's come up quite a lot is that I think normally thought is not necessarily in Judaism, just in particular, is that we are normal, and then there are some great people that do great things. And as Michael pointed out in the last lesson, that in the times of Abraham, everyone that wasn't Abraham can't be faulted for what they were doing wrong. They were doing what was normal, but they weren't Abraham. They weren't remembered forever. They weren't different. And I think it's not just to be normal and to let those few great people do great things. I think every one of us can be like Abraham, can be like Rav Sacks, or at least do something that has an impact. Have our letter in the scroll. And I think that's really important.
I think we've heard a lot about Rav Sacks over the past few weeks, and I think that even before that, a lot of the ideas that our yeshiva speaks about and represents are Rav Sacks's ideologies, and I didn't really realize that as so completely and get such a full picture as I did today. I felt that it was really, really a wholesome idea of who Rav Sacks was and what Rav Sacks represented. And I thought it was really interesting how so much that we learn and that we talk about connects to it. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Okay, so if in 60 seconds, where next? What can we do?
Right, Sacks would have definitely said that it's not enough just to read his work, you've got to do something. In an interview once somebody said, what can we know about God? And the question came back from Rabbi Sacks was, well, what can God know about you? Right? He always he saw this image of Avram Avinu being told Lech Lecha by God, and basically that we're all being told Lech Lecha. And he would have taken that in any number of different ways. In some of his books, he talks about Jewish continuity and learning. And he says, if you don't learn, it's not going to be any continuity. That's how we're going to do it. So one thing will be learn. He wouldn't have been satisfied with that. And he would have basically said, more than that, you've got to do kiruv, you've got to spread the word to Jews. You've got to be a kiddush Hashem to the world. You've got to do chesed. So Rabbi Sacks was really all about, turning all of that into action.
I 100%. I've only really started reflecting on it now. Now that we're in this devastating place where his work is now complete, as in we're not going to get any more. He's not. When Rav Soloveitchik passed away, they found a tremendous amount of material that has never been published. They're not going to find out with Rav Sacks because he was prolific. He published everything. So this is it. We have it. So what's next? I don't know that I'd love to think that there will be a Rabbi Sacks in this room, the next Rabbi Sacks. I don't know where the next Rabbi Sacks is going to come from, but kind of just as you said, we're not all going to be Rabbi Sackses. We can all be students of Rabbi Sacks, even in the way that Alex and I were lucky enough to have somewhat of a personal connection to him, but we call ourselves students of him, not because we got a chance at length to sit and learn from him and with him, but rather because we've been studying him even from afar, especially living in Israel, where I feel frustrated to have been a little bit more distant, but I still feel as a student of his, because I've had a chance to interact with his writings and through the videos, and hearing him speak. You can't hear him speak live with everything else you've got, so if you want to, you get to be a student of his, and you get to say to your children when you have them, I'm a student of Rabbi Sacks. So I don't, this is not the end of his thoughts and his ideas. You represent the continuation of it. But I think what's more important than his thoughts and his ideas, and I've only started reflecting on it really since he died, is that it wasn't theoretical philosophy that stayed in the Migdal Shen in English is ivory tower of either academia or the Bet Midrash. That wasn't his thought. His thought is so practical. It is a clarion call to go out there and build a world that is in the image of Torah Judaism. And that's what we have to do now. So he's left us with that legacy. We have to fulfill his legacy by doing that. So I would say we have to be the Jews that he called on us to be and build the Jewish society here in Israel, or if it has to be wherever you go back to, in the image of his ideas and his philosophies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.